Now, we are at the Stop, Look, and Listen, part 7 out of 12. And so, again, we use this little imagery here, this that I grew up with. And Stop, Look, and Listen each consists of 4 components. And by way of quick review, the 4 for Stop were, first of all, solitude and silence. Being contemplatives in action was the second part. And then actually learning how to practice his presence, which is a thing that is commanded, but often overlooked and not actually applied. And then also, not just the journey, but also the story, to have a bigger vision of the narrative in which we are a part. And we begin to realize we are on this voyage of life, and there is a whole pilgrim story that underlies it. And then the first of the look exercises was learning to see what others miss. And I showed you a number of little collections and so forth. And then last week, we looked at another aspect of looking, and it's cultivating wonder, curiosity, and submission, because I was saying that everyone is exposed to beauty. We're all exposed to beauty, but how many actually wonder at it? And then even a smaller number are curious enough to want to know more. Enough smaller yet are actually willing to submit to the mystery that is underlying that rich beauty. So it's a kind of, how can we respond? So I showed you some of my favorite images, including the puffer fish, who creates this thing that is as magnificent as a rose window, and things of this nature. And of course, the bowerbird, who imitates the sounds of children, and how God makes these things. And the more you learn about the world, the more astonishing it becomes. So it's not going to be a diminishment. In fact, it becomes more. For me, I'm actually becoming frightened by it because it's so terrifying in its implications on every order of magnitude. Now we're going to be doing a third exercise. So this is going to be recalibrating your life. I think there's a good name for a book there. And, oh, there it is. So I remember designing this cover with my friend Stephen Krotz, and we made it kind of whimsical with the storms and so forth. And really, this symbolizes Scylla and Charybdis, and they're going through these areas of great treachery with the winds and so forth. But you notice that it gets through on the other side, and then it brings us to the outskirts. You don't see the land itself, very much of it, but it brings you to the outskirts. So all of that, is it not a symbol of our own journey, how we all have navigation, we're navigating transitions, but God has us on a journey, and it's going to take us safely home. The fact is, when he told him to get in the boat, I'll take you to the other side, he didn't say that there wouldn't be a storm. So why is it that some people's lives are like an outing on the, where basically it's like on the QE2. They're going from one place to another, and they're in luxury. And then other people, it's like a storm-tossed dinghy. But both get the other side. That's the interesting thing. How long it takes and how arduous the journey will be is going to be between the Lord and you. But ultimately, we are in the same destiny and journey. And so we all need these 3 things: perspective, purpose, and practice. And so the perspective, what gives meaning to life. And so our outline there is to leave a godly legacy. So what we're looking at is to look at our lives and have a perspective. That's the whole concept here in this exercise. So what does it mean to have a godly legacy? And that legacy, I'm going to argue, transcends DNA. It's not just your children. Your biggest impact may well be outside of your family. And so there's that, not just to limit yourself to that idea of the genetic component, but actually it's a richer understanding than that. Your legacy, numbering your days. You've heard me wax and wane on that topic so many times about the 90 years and then the 90 days and then the 90 minutes and then the 90 seconds to really help us grasp. Or the other approach of my womb world analogy, of course, which I'll again remind you about. All of these are perspectives, and then treasuring God and people. And so how do we learn to treasure God? Because there's such a danger here. I was showing this little thing here, where the real danger is that although we're called to worship God and love people and use things, often we worship self and use people and love things. So it's kind of an upside down deal, depending on what's the centrality. If it's Christ is at the center, then you will actually love people and hold things with a loose grip. But if it's not, you're going to be tending to go the other way around. But in seeing this, vision of what it means then to treasure God and people, and then to move from career to calling, knowing that your calling, your vocation, your vocare, remember what that word means? Vocare, the Latin word? Means what? Call, yes, a calling, vocare. So when we get the word a vocation, it came to be used of your job, didn't it? I have a vocation. But actually before that it was not. It was meant that they have a calling to ministry or something of that sort. You see, you have a vocation in that sense. But really, my view is that we all have a vocation. We all have a calling, and it transcends your career. And therefore, you have an identity that transcends just the happenstances of life. It's a stable and firm basis for being. See, an unchanging reason for being. Every man needs an unchanging reason for being. Something that's not going to vacillate and fluctuate with the circumstances of life and the seasons of life. So that's what we're looking for. And a better vision of what does it mean of retirement. And then what gives direction? So we need to understand God's purposes. And he has an ultimate purpose. Then he has, a universal purpose. And then he has a unique purpose. And God's ultimate purpose, nobody grasps. We have ideas about it. It's doxological. It has to do with his pleasure and glory. And that is as it ought to be, because the wellspring of beauty, goodness, and truth should therefore be honored in that way. But still, it's more than that. Why did he make us? Why did he choose to make us? You see, and these are mysteries we can't really grasp. In fact, why did he love Israel? I loved you, he says to them in Deuteronomy 6, because I chose to love you. It's not something intrinsic in you that made me love you, but it's something, or that you performed, you see, which is the only basis for security, is it not? To have one who loves you in spite of and regardless of anything that you do. It's not because of something you do that earns it. So therefore, nothing you can do can make him love you more. Nothing you can do to make him love you less. And so this is a security. And so understanding that purpose then, that God's purpose is to call you into that position of security, significance, and satisfaction, so that you can then manifest the values of the kingdom to come, even in this present age. It's an amazing thought. And he's given you people. He's put people in your life, sovereignly implanted. And in your unique purpose, because the universal is evangelism and edification. We're all called to the Great Commission, which entails this evangelism as well, so that they go into the world. But it's a Great Commission call. That's a universal purpose. Evangelism and edification, I call it E squared. And the idea then, that's your real universal. But what's your unique purpose? How do you uniquely reflect that E squared in your life, in your circumstance, as opposed to another? And it's a good thing for a person to recalibrate and revisit. Of course, with this recalibration, you need to calibrate before you recalibrate. So some people haven't really calibrated properly, or it's been a false calibration using the wrong metrics. So you have to kind of go back and have a vision for what that looks like. And then finally, the stewardship issues of time, talent, treasure, truth, and people. I couldn't find a T for people. I've been given many suggestions, but none of them work. Team, I'm trying to remember what the term, but everyone has been forced. If you can find me an unforced T, I'll be happy to see it. But there you have it. But most people limit it just to the first three, but they fail to realize that no, that it's your time, talent, and treasure that actually are the things that are passing away, and you're to make friends for yourself by means of the wealth of unrighteousness, so that when it fails, which when you die, they'll be there to receive you into the eternal dwelling. So here, the wisdom of stewardship is to leverage, to transmit, to transpose, in fact, that which is passing away, time, talent, and treasure, into what? The two goods that will endure forever. You never met a mere mortal, and the word of God is eternal. So if you can build eternal truth into eternal beings, isn't that a smart way to live? That's a smart, and you're only living out of suitcases. You know that. You're living in hotel rooms. The best house you've got is you're living out of suitcases. You're not home. You're a pilgrim. But all of us are called to this kind of a ministry, and it's good to us recalibrate where I am. And the older we get, the more frequently we should be doing that. So you kind of review that on a consistent basis. So then it comes down to that in the conclusion, living in such a way that the best is yet to come. And that's the way I like to see it. So just a few summary bits. So I've selected a few pages that will illustrate some of the key themes I'd like to get across. It'd be too much to try to give you the overview of the book. This will help. So first of all, I talk about a Kairos recalibration. You know we've talked about Kairos versus Chronos. Kairos is something you can't put in your planner. Chronos you do. Therefore, the hard part for us is that sometimes God's going to force you to calibrate whether you like it or not. He's going to give you an opportunity. Either some great joy, could be a birth, or could be a wedding, or some great pain. But one way or another, you're going to be forced to calibrate. But then there's another kind of a Chronos calibration, and that's what we're talking about in this book, where you actually plan a recalibration rather than being a Kairos. Does it make sense? So there's a kind of a discipline which you plan, and that's why we then talk about a one-day retreat or a half-day retreat, and we even have a guide as to how to do such a retreat, because it can be one of the most valuable things you do. So God, in fact, invites us to recalibrate, and actually, more than invites us, kind of forces us in some cases to recalibrate, and that is a healthy thing. One of the other things that I mentioned is I see in those moments time often dilated for me. Oh yeah, this is where I'm talking about my, now it's 19 near-death experiences. And I'm fussy about what I define as a near-death experience. So I've had 19. I'm not sure why so many. I must be a slow learner. But it'd be an interesting thing to go through all 19 and to see what lesson did I learn in each, because each one is a different kind of a circumstance. But my life, and several of them did involve time dilation, where I really do see my whole life. And when I was about to drown in the Sea of Galilee, for example, what happened was that I was you couldn't get a purchase. The storm came through, and I couldn't get to the shore. It was about a tenth of a mile away. I just couldn't get there. And I was losing all my energy. This is a long time. It is so violent. And because the nature of that is that the wind can funnel in these two mountains on the left, and it's like a saucer, because it's not as a deep a lake as some. And so as a result, it can be suddenly just like that. And I saw the storm coming. So I got about maybe a third of the way in, and then I couldn't get any further. It was so violent. So I had that experience where my entire life, and then I knew with clarity there's unfinished business. And when I realized, so I was ready to go, but there was unfinished business. And when I knew that was unfinished business, suddenly, I do not know how, because it was way off, I was there at the end of I was there. But then I couldn't get a purchase on the rocks, they were too slippery. Next thing I knew, I was in the top. I do not know how that happened. But I do remember the experience very well. And it was a reminder, memento mori. And you are now living on borrowed time to accomplish unfinished business. Well, that's true of all of us. In my case, that was made painfully obvious, but we all are living, every day is a gift. And you don't know how many things that you averted. So many things, you don't even know what near-death experiences you had. Even driving here this morning, you may have had some, you don't even know it. Some goofball was about to do this and that. And it's not bad enough that civility is diminished and attention and courtesy and all these. But then we're distracted as well. So you can always tell when this guy's about to hit the barrier and all that. You do not know when something like that will happen. Your life, as I've often said, is like a thinnest of gossamer threads holding you together, and you don't even know. But every day then must be treated in such a way to live each day as if it could be the last. That's my point here. And so we emphasize this nature here what if there's a tool, there's 18 tools. This tool is, what if you had 1 year to live? So it forces you to ask, if you were given that, this film called Living, Bill Nighy, came out this year. And it was a very interesting film, but it was based on Akira Kurosawa's film Akira, which means to live. It was done in 1952. Much better film. But the point there is that in both instances, here's a person who has cancer, and he's given 6 months. That's it. And in both cases, what you have then, because the others are basically reprise of the other, is that he changes his life accordingly because he's got 6 fixed months. He knows that there is a deadline, literally. But here's the point. Aren't we crazy to suppose we have 6 months? You see, isn't that presumptuous to suppose you have 6 months? Then if you, just because you knew the finish line, I remember, I think it was Samuel Johnson who said that the prospect of being hung in a fortnight marvelously clarifies the mind. If you knew you were going to be hung in a fortnight, if you knew that you were in death row and here's your date, that'll clarify your thoughts. But why do you suppose it's going to be you have a fortnight? How do you know you have another day? It's a fool who presumes on that. And therefore, we're called to recalibrate on a consistent basis and reprocess those issues. So that we have little guides for that. Here's another one. The coffin becomes an evangelist, speaking to us more eloquently than the cradle. I'm just pulling out some little samplers here for you to give you a feel for the book itself. Table 10 is actually processing the book, as I understand it. How far along are you in your reading? And what's happened to Table 10? You've decimated. You who once flourished are now vastly diminished. Sin. Be sure your sin will find you out. Has been sin in the camp. But at any rate, they're studying the book. But frankly, we do well to recalibrate our lives and to revisit and review. Yes.
Jay Hendricks is undergoing prostate treatment.
That's right. Jay told me that. He explained why I wouldn't be seeing him for a while, because on Friday mornings he's doing that. The prognosis is good, but you see, yeah, that's when my father gave me this advice. He says, "Don't get old, son." Thank you for that helpful advice. You know, I'll try to avoid getting old. Are you kidding me? So this crisis of mortality, you see. So I was privileged a couple of weeks ago to have, in the same week, to see a second birth, to celebrate a second birth, a baptism, my brother-in-law, and secondly, to a second birth canal with my friend Stumpy Tomerlin. And it was an amazing experience. And of course, how utterly uncomfortable his relatives were, because I spoke at Patterson's funeral home for about 100 of his closest relatives. I didn't know any of them. And it was an amazing thing because you could just feel it. It was palpable. I told them, you're not comfortable at all. This is a hard thing, because a window of reality has been opened again. And you don't like to ask those fundamental questions about, well, who am I? Where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? But the coffin forces you to ask those questions because it gives you a window of vulnerability to the realities, because these statistics really are impressive. 1 out of 1 does die. So it's not a question of if. So therefore, and so I assured them, I know that you're uncomfortable, but I wanted them to know that there is an answer, that there's life on both sides, you see, so that we can see we're not in the land of the dying going to the land of the living going to the land of the dying. You know, I've said this. Land of the dying, going to the land of the living. And then I use my womb world analogy. Remember that one? So I won't go into it. But basically, the idea that Earth, this is a second womb, and therefore birth, what we call death, is actually a second birth canal. That really changes my vision of life. So I'm anticipating that, and then trying to train myself to actually have a greater apprehension and desire for it, as I'll say in just a moment. What we call death, then, is a second birth canal, as I've just mentioned there. And then I also talk about this, and you've heard me mention this as well, but it's in the book. It's wise to leave each day as if it were our last, and to treat each person as though we would never see them again. We recall the 3 things. Don't leave unfinished business in relationships. If there's something wrong, make sure you have that dealt with. And secondly, don't defer your love. Why don't you tell them and make it clear? And never wait to say your best words at a funeral. You see that, and it's too late. You should speak your love while the person's still there. And then third, your gratitude. So love, gratitude, forgiveness. My point is, then you will live without regrets if you hear. Because I don't know about you, but when someone dies, I think of my last meeting with them. You see, and that could be significant. So if I had assurance that I really had it right, so I try to keep short tabs that way with people. And if that's the way, then I don't live with regret. And I know where that my friend is gone. And so it's a very hopeful and helpful thing. As I said, and I'm jumping ahead to another page because we're almost out of time. Although we may retire from a job or profession, God's call for us to work for his kingdom and bear spiritual fruit doesn't come with an expiration date. That you will, and this is why I tell people, and I did this in Lynbrook and also Canterbury Court with these octogenarians, nonagenarians, some even centenarians. You see, people whose little dash between the dates was a slightly bit longer, but it's all a dash. And I said, you think you're in a waiting room, basically, waiting to die. And some of you are wondering why you have lived this long. But I was trying to encourage them to realize, though your diminishment is evident, and our diminishment will be such that, as I've told you before, age conspires with God. It's a conspiracy, I tell you, to transfer our hope from the temporal to the eternal. Because if you go to age 20 and you don't age a bit more, you wouldn't have much of an aspiration, would you, for homecoming. So to become world weary and homesick, this conspires to help us become realistic and recognize the brevity of the earthbound sojourn. So we live with wisdom, teach us to number our days, because without that wisdom, you're not going to actually walk in godly perspective, but in earthbound wisdom. Remember the difference between the heavenly wisdom and the earthbound wisdom. The earthbound wisdom is cagey, conniving, cunning, and crafty. There's 4 C's for you. Cagey, conniving, cunning, and crafty. That is the wisdom from below. But you and I are called to live a wisdom that's from above, which is pure and full of fruit of righteousness and the love and joy and peace that it evokes. So this is a way of true wisdom. And then I on another page, I wanted to make sure I mentioned this, because these are some of the major themes I've tried to select to just give you an overview of what I have in mind about recalibrating your life. But your God-given calling, and that is your vocation, unchanging reason for being. So unlike a career, our unique purpose comes with no expiration date. It is lifelong. So he's always preparing us for our unique purpose. Even before we've decided to follow him. It doesn't mean we're aware of it our entire lives. And so there's a growing into your purpose. There's a sense in which you apprehend it. And the closer you become to Jesus, the more you become attuned with his intentions, aspirations, and desires for your life, and the more you're willing to trust him to submit to it. So it becomes a more synergistic union. It's not something that's at loggerheads with your best interests, but you've come to gradually grow enough to know that though you suppose you have your best interests at heart, you really, of course, do not. You cannot know your best interest. You do have to admit this. You'd have to be omniscient to know your best interest. You'd have to know the future before you can determine whether this decision you're making now is really the best. You couldn't know. So then, even though we acknowledge that, we act as if we have a better idea than God. So therefore, we kick against the goads and resist his prodding and prompting. But it's always for our good. And so he calls us to have a life of fulfillment and order and meaning. That's significant. Elsewhere we give some purpose statements along this idea of purpose. And I've adapted some that can be adapted for personal use. If you want to take a purpose statement from Scripture, you could start with, because I think every one of us needs a purpose statement. And if you haven't got one, start with something rather than having nothing, and then play out, and you'll discover something else will come to your mind. It took me a long while to hammer out mine, to be a lover and servant of God and others, and each word means a good deal to me. Or to lose my life for his sake, have the mind of Christ and everything. These aren't bad purposes. But you see, and then there's some others that I have actually collected from other people. But the point is, you want to have some purpose statement. Why is it that we have purpose statements for our businesses and not for our lives? It's very interesting. So you want to ask that question. If you don't have one, you want to work on that. And this guides you in a little bit in that area as well. We can't control chronos. You can seize every kairos. to do what the owner of clock time desires. So really, on a daily basis, I'm becoming more acutely conscious of my pull to hold on to my chronos and to not want my chronos to be manipulated by God's kairos. And so I realize I've got to empty myself of my own ambitions. I have to have a kind of emptying, kenosis. I have to deny myself a kenosis, to empty yourself, in order to receive God's better good. We have what we construe as our good. He has a better good. And for you to trust him enough to say that what he has in mind for you this day is better than what you had planned takes some measure of risk. So there's going to be a constant process. I die daily. It's happening. You have to happen multiple times a day. So then you begin to seize that, and you realize again that the most important thing you do before your head hits the pillow tonight will not have been on your planner. It'll be some conversation, some event, something of that. Even if within the call, something happened that you didn't plan. And that's where I think God is at work. The last couple of points is remain lifelong students and appliers of the truth, because here is where I was talking about the temptation when we're young. Our problem is naivete and lack of focus. And our problem in our middle years usually is double-mindedness and entanglement, where you're trying to play by two sets of rules. But in our older years, our problem becomes increasingly that of being teachable. And being, or am I going to be intractable, or will I be teachable? Will I then be supple enough and fluid enough so that I don't suffer from the hardening of the categories, that terrible disease which is worse than hardening of the arteries? Because you become rigid, inflexible, and intolerant, and you're not able to see a both-andedness of life anymore. You have a thin vision of life, and you're focusing very often in that case on what you're against rather than what you're for. So that really the true beauty is to love his beauty and to submit to that and always learn from him and see there's going to be surprises. And finally, I talk about the having an appetite for home. And we did a special session on that here last year. I think it was in October, about what you won't have and what you will have. And it's not a bad it's a great trade-off. So those are just some of the things. And then finally, we had an index of tools in this book. And some of them are also online, but Rooting Your Identity in Christ, a guide to a personal recalibration retreat, which I think would be a very good exercise for you to try. Principles and values to live by. In fact, I'm going to amplify. I'm going to do that tool. I'm going to be doing a special session for you. You know how I like certain biblical numbers? One of them is 12. I have 3 sets of 12 principles and values to live by. 3, count them. Trinitarian, 12, very good numbers. So I'm going to be giving you a little session. So you don't even know that. It'll be our next session. The principles and values to live by. And then other areas as well. Assessing your values, your decision style, and readiness. And the Hartman value profile is very helpful in this respect. Are you a sage or on the road to becoming one? And so we want to be transgenerational influencers. And then as well, what am I leaving behind? How do I invest in relationship? Even writing your own eulogy. So these are practical things that can help you get your affairs in order. So that's just part of the concept there. So those are some of the tools. Now for your time at around your table, I'm leaving this list of tools up here. Which one would be the one that you would most be interested in pursuing and why? You got 18 tools. Which one of these is the most interesting? Pick your top 3. See what you come. That'll actually be revelatory, because the very choices that you make will actually demonstrate what your sense of need is. We all need these in one way or another. So that's going to be your exercise to go to that. I reached an interesting conclusion with my group, which I'll share with you in a moment. But before I do that, how did that work for you? Was it interesting and illuminating at all? What, someone pick out what was number one for them and why. Relations. Yeah, several in my group mentioned about that idea of relationship assessment. Obviously, relationships are the currency of heaven. And then I was showing them a couple of these as well, and out of the actual manuscript of the book. What other one hit you?
Kim, we talked about legacy and the depths of that legacy. An exercise that you mentioned in your book was to write a letter to your children, your grandchildren. And it's so important. You share with them, of course, your witness, how you came to Christ, but also what has happened to you in your life, major events where you really have needed to rely on the Lord Jesus, and He's come through for you. And it'll be a way of encouraging them through.
Yeah, it's a spiritual history you're conveying, and that they'll learn more about you in that terms, not just your values, but how did you learn from this? How did you navigate those waters? And how were you shaped by suffering? That's a very interesting, honest question about how did I become a different person? As you know, you can't be the same, either better or bitter. So it's not an option. What other ones came to someone?
I guess it was probably
yes,
number 17, I guess, on
number
your
17
list was the
writing life letters.
Yeah, life letters. My granddaughter gave me a book, and I can't remember the title, but it was basically Tell Me About Your Life. And I thought that was kind of revealing that she had a desire to know who I was.
Yeah.
And it really reflected on me how much or how little I knew about my father. And I thought that was very insightful for a young lady. She's at that point in time was a freshman in college, to emphasize how important it was to her to know who I am.
Yes. None of my relatives have done that. And I look back now, and there are many instances in which I'm now sorrowful that I did not really ask better questions when I had a chance of all these people that I've been privileged to know, my relatives, and also mentors and people who were important in my life. I never inquired. Now it's too late in many instances. I wish I'd known. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah.
I would highly encourage you to do what Don was talking about. My sons were after me quite some years ago now, probably 10, 12 years ago, to do that. And so I have done that. My life letter is equivalent of about a 200-page book.
Huh.
And I would encourage each of you to do that.
Write a 200-page book, would you please?
But yes, I wished I would have known, about my parents, my grandparents.
Yeah.
I have 1,000 questions I could ask them now.
Yes. I'm the same way. I just had this interesting experience because when I went to the baptism of my brother-in-law, my sister Kelly, who's 15 years younger, gave me my older sister Gay, who went to be with the Lord last year, her photos. And there were many I had never seen before of my youth. So I've scanned those ones, and it's interesting. But I so long, who was this? How I wish I'd known who these people were. Why? Because they shaped me in varying ways. And so knowing about their story, you see, it's not a disembodied encounter, but rather you're talking not just about knowing a person, but knowing them in the sense of experiential and personal and relational knowledge. But knowing their history and their values and their perspectives and their struggles only enriches that. Of course, there's some who've gone through so much trauma they don't want to share it. And that can be the case. My father in the Second World War, I think those were his best years in terms of relationships. Yes.
I selected the last one, number 18 there. Writing your own eulogy. Because
Yeah.
like the idea of beginning with the end in mind.
Mm.
What do I want to be remembered for?
Yes.
And thus I will, during the rest of my days here, I will be more focused on that side of things. But the other thing with writing a letter, and my brother-in-law did this with my now 91-year-old father-in-law, is we have a technology called video. And so my brother-in-law, who does this for a living with the North Carolina Baptist, they interviewed him, and they asked the pertinent questions. So having somebody answer the questions and do it on videotape you get to see the interaction. You get to see
That's right.
the body language
Yeah.
and stuff.
That's very valuable, though, having such a thing. I wanted to close. We'll have one more, and then I want to share a thought that I had. Yes.
Ken, just to emphasize your point, classmate of mine from Naval Academy, former Marine Corps officer, fell down the stairs last night and died. It comes quickly without notice.
Yes,
And
yes.
his wife is, of course, devastated, and all of our classmates are coming together for next week for his funeral. But it's not theoretical what you're speaking about.
Yes, that's right.
About you don't know what's coming, you don't have your time frame, and you wake up to an email that you've lost a
Yes.
classmate.
Did you have, in that reading of that, did you think of your last meeting with him? Your last encounter with this person?
Yes, in a very painful way.
Yes.
Meaning that he lives in Marietta, or lived in Marietta. I haven't seen him in a long time.
Yeah.
I see friends in Colorado and
Yeah.
Wyoming more than I see
Yeah.
this guy down the street. So it's with regret. I've got to figure out what to say to his
Yeah,
wife.
it's a hard thing, isn't it? Because we want to live with closure in a very real sense, in that sense, but as if it would be the last time you'd see him, which relates to this. I know we were just about out of time, but one of the things that we mentioned was this idea of principles and values to live by, and I just alluded to this. And in the book itself, it refers to that. It's like this, but actually in Conform to His Image, it turned out that the original group of them was from Conform to His Image. And I had a list of 40 principles and values to live by. And then what we did is, so out of these, they were not organized in any, they're all good things to do, but then what we ended up doing is we created this document that looks like this, because you see, if you go there, it won't show the entire list. You have to go to this particular website to go there, recalibrateyourlife.org. But this is it. And there are now 12 about pursuing God. And then there are 12 about pursuing godly character. And then third, there are 12 referring to highest good of others. And one of the people in my group, the Zoom group, said, that'd be a great retreat. It'd be fun to do something like that. But, it's a lot of stuff, because each one of these is a hold fast to hope, to deepen your love, value the temper over the eternal, grow in grace. Each one of these is a critical theme, as you can see. Seek fresh bread. Yesterday's faith is today's sight. Cultivating and seeing, you see what I'm doing. So that'll be a fun thing to do. I don't know the rate in which I should do it, though. I'm thinking out loud with you right now, because you see, it would be a 36-part series. That may be a bit too long. So I'm going to have to think about the delivery. What do you think, Dennis?
Yes. When might
Maybe four at a time. That's not bad. I could do 4 at a time. Working it out, then I'd have 3. You see, so there would be 12 sessions. 12's a good number. Just saying.